Don Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities. Before we get going, and we have a stellar panel today, but before we get going, just a couple of points. One, if you're a student and you did not sign in on the way in, please make sure to sign in on the way out. Second, this event is being live streamed, and a recording of it will be posted in the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. Now, towards the end of the event, we will be taking questions related to the central theme of today's event. This is the first day of Hess Week. We had a wonderful welcome ceremony. It is good to see some of you who were there this morning join us again. Tomorrow, we will have 3 events. Right here at the Tanger Auditorium at 11 a.m., History and the Courts. At 12:15, Dobbs and the Future of Our Individual Rights. And at 3:40, the role of the courts in our democracy. Timely and urgent conversations led by our Hess Scholar, Melissa Murray. And to start our conversation, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Naomi Braine from the Department of Sociology. Thank you again for being here.
All right, so thank you. Thank you, Gaston, and especially thank you to our panelists. So the Dobbs decision and its aftermath has brought into focus powerful issues surrounding democracy, its meaning, our history with it, the different forms that democracy can take, the role of the courts and legislatures, and also the role of people. That democracy is a process that takes place at multiple social levels and in multiple social contexts, all of which are particularly salient right now as we live through a period in which the rule of law is really coming into question and is coming under significant pressure. So I would ask that we keep in mind all of these different layers and locations within which democracy takes place. And I have to go back and forth between my reading glasses. I can't see you when I have my reading glasses on, sorry. So at any rate, so I invite us all to keep in mind the different ways in which democracy operates, the different layers of it within our society, and this particular salience of its interaction with questions of law and the rule of law in this moment that we are living through at the start of the second Trump administration. But today our topic is abortion and democracy. And our panelists today are Alexis McGill Johnson, who is the president and CEO of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund. Barbara Smith, activist, author, co-founder of the Combahee River Collective, a publisher with Kitchen Table Press, and the Hess Scholar-in Residence from 2023, which some of you may remember. And of course, Melissa Murray, who is our current Hess Scholar-in Residence, and who we will all be getting to know much better during this week. So I will now step down and back into my moderating role, and I invite you just to participate, perhaps in the order in which you are seated.
All right, thank you all for being here this afternoon, and again, it's really a pleasure to be here, to be the Hess Scholar, and to be in conversation with you all this week. I first want to just invite you to think about the whole idea of democracy. If we think about democracy in the classical sense, that is like from ancient Greece, democracy actually depends in large part on homogeneity, right? So one of the things that characterized Grecian society, or certainly Athenian society, was they were relatively homogeneous. They were like each other in important ways. They shared the same values in critical ways. And in that regard, government by the people was relatively easy because the people were relatively similar to one another and were likely to reach consensus about critical issues. That's not the kind of democracy that we imagine for the United States today, right? So the democracy that we imagine is one marked by incredible pluralism, both in terms of religion and ethnicity and race, gender, and experience and ideology. So across multiple axes, we are heterogeneous as opposed to homogeneous. And I want to posit that that kind of heterogeneity is not necessarily intrinsic to the classical understanding of democracy as we've inherited it. And perhaps that helps explain why democracy in this moment seems to be under such pressure. The title of the panel is about abortion and democracy, though, and so let me step back from just laying that foundation for thinking about what democracy is and what it is not, and maybe say a few words about Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization, which was the 2022 case that the United States Supreme Court decided that withdrew the right to abortion that had been recognized since 1973's Roe versus Wade. In Dobbs, a majority of the court withdrew the abortion right on the view that the right was neither explicit in the text of the Constitution nor deeply rooted in the history or traditions of this country. And more importantly, the Dobbs court said that it was returning this question to the states and to the people so that it would be subject to democratic deliberation. That was the idea. If the Constitution made no provision for a right to abortion, then it was a question that was best left to the people to decide for themselves. Democracy in action. Now, I'll just say at the outset, I don't think that state-by-state settlement that the Dobbs court imagined is a lasting settlement. Regardless of where you stand on democracy, if you believe that abortion is a species of murder, as I believe many in the anti-abortion movement do, you can't be okay with California and New York committing murder on a regular basis. So this is not a lasting settlement, this idea of a state-by-state settlement. So I think what we have seen in the wake of Dobbs is democratic deliberation on the question of abortion. I'll talk more about that. But still this push toward a more lasting settlement that will answer the question once and for all whether abortion will be permitted in the United States. And I would argue that we are moving toward a settlement where we are not thinking about letting each state do as they wish, but rather we are moving toward an environment where we recognize the fetus as a person and abortion as murder, and therefore the complete and total abolition of abortion in the United States. So let me talk a little bit about the question of democratic deliberation in the wake of Dobbs. The court gave this question over to the people, and Justice Alito actually had some semi-trolly things to say to the people and to women in general when he wrote the Dobbs opinion. One of the things he noted was that women are not without electoral and political power. He says this toward the end of his opinion. And his point is really clear. Now that we've returned this to the people for democratic deliberation, ladies, if you are exercised about the loss of these rights, you have an avenue for correcting it. You may go to the ballot box and you can register your preferences about abortion there. And interestingly, women in America seem to have taken him up on that. In the wake of Dobbs, we have seen a number of different direct democracy measures on the question of abortion. Direct democracy is the means by which, through ballot initiatives or voter referenda, the voters can go directly to the ballot box and register their preference for a particular issue without the mediating factor of representative government. So when we have representative government, we have to rely on our representatives to translate our interests into policy, whereby with direct democracy, we can simply go to the ballot box and we can translate those interests directly there. In August, just after Dobbs had been decided, in August of 2022, the United States saw a number of different things happen. So in Indiana, a very red state, the state legislature of Indiana passed one of the most draconian bans on abortion. Not surprising for a red state. But just nearby in Kansas, just a few days later, Kansas voters went to the ballot box to preserve access to abortion in their state. And they did so directly. There was a voter initiative on the ballot that was sought to protect the gains made in a state constitutional case. And Kansans went to the ballot box. It's a very red state. And they nonetheless voted directly to preserve abortion access in that state. What explains the difference? These are two very red states, very much Republican states, Republican-controlled legislatures, and in one we have one of the most draconian abortion bans in the country pass, and days later we have the people of the state going to the ballot box to preserve abortion access. It doesn't translate. It doesn't align. One of the reasons why it may not necessarily align is because in Kansas, the people were allowed to register their preferences directly through the voter initiative. In Indiana, they had to have their interests mediated and acted upon by their representatives. And interestingly, in Indiana, there's a high degree of gerrymandering in the state legislature. So even if a majority of Indianans favor some measure of reproductive freedom, because the state legislature has been gerrymandered and configured so as to consolidate Republican or conservative control in the state house, those interests of the populace are not necessarily translated into policies. Instead, you see a skew where the state is voting in favor of a very draconian ban on abortion where the people might not actually be in favor of it. Right? So in Indiana, you actually have distorted democracy because of gerrymandering, because of campaign finance, all of the things that make it harder for the people to see their interests translated into actual policy. In Kansas, though, where people can go directly to the ballot box, they're allowed to register their preferences, and they do so overwhelmingly in favor of reproductive freedom. The success in Kansas galvanized support for direct democracy as a means of safeguarding reproductive freedom in the wake of Dobbs. And so we saw in the midterm elections a number of different states put abortion on the ballot. And in most cases, it was successful. What we also saw, though, is that for some people, too much democracy can be a bad thing. So in Ohio, for example, conservatives recognizing that Ohioans had a ballot amendment on the ballot that would secure abortion access, started changing the rules, like making a higher threshold or trying to make a higher threshold to actually enact a ballot initiative, or changing the number of signatures that were needed to put something on the ballot. So this is something that we're seeing as a development in the wake of these gains, trying to limit the people's voice through procedural and other kinds of shenanigans. This really reached a fever pitch in the 2024 presidential election, where there were ballot initiatives related to abortion on 10 states, in 10 different states. And for the most part, they were successful with just a few exceptions. Three initiatives didn't win on the abortion question. But what was even more interesting, though, is that in those states where people voted for reproductive freedom, places like Missouri, they also voted for Donald Trump. Right? So we have this kind of skew where we have people voting to preserve abortion access on the state level, while on the federal level, voting into office someone who has proven to be hostile to reproductive freedom. And to be clear, in the run-up to the election, candidate Trump was more ambiguous and ambivalent about his position on abortion. Although he had earlier in his candidacy trumpeted the fact that he had appointed 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices who had voted to overrule Roe versus Wade, he was much more ambivalent about where he stood on abortion in the run-up to the election. And that's by design. It was clear from the midterms and from Kansas that abortion was a galvanizing issue. And so the question really was, could abortion bring women out in numbers, or was there a way to diminish the force of the people's individual views on reproductive freedom, or to give them a permission structure to vote for reproductive freedom while also voting for other things? And I want to suggest that in the aftermath of the 2024 election, I think that's really what we got. This idea that the fact of those ballot initiatives on the ballot gave people a way to exercise their interest in reproductive freedom, but it didn't completely diminish whatever appetite they had for economic malaise or for vindicating their interests with regard to the economy. Instead, it gave them a way to do both things. They could deal with their anxieties about reproductive freedom while also dealing with their economic anxieties by voting for Donald Trump. And so I want to suggest, just going forward, as we think about what the road looks like for preserving reproductive freedom such that it is in a democracy, we have a lot to contend with. We have to contend with incredible electoral distortion in the states in terms of gerrymandering, in terms of the amount of money that can be funneled into individual races. We are seeing that today in Wisconsin, where there is a highly contested state Supreme Court election in which Elon Musk has donated a ton of money to fuel one candidate's prospects. We are going to see even more of this going forward, with more of the billionaire class channeling the funds that they have into politics. That's a distortion. It distorts the electoral landscape. We are also going to see, I think, going forward, more and more methods whereby we tinker with the mechanisms of direct democracy in the states where they exist in order to make it harder for the people to actually activate their interests through direct democracy. And so that leaves the question, if Dobbs left this to democracy, and if we are supposed to be deciding this in a democratic fashion, at least until we begin moving towards something else, what protections will exist for democracy? Because democracy, as much as abortion, is very much imperiled in this moment.
I assume that all of these mics. Is this one operating? Good, thank you. So I was asked to speak about my history of organizing for reproductive rights and freedom. And I have some feelings of contradiction about that at this time, because of the fact that most of the actual organizing that I did was when Roe was in place. And that's not, that in place by which I mean was a constitutional right, recognized as a constitutional right. But now, of course, that is not the case post-Dobbs. So I'm going to talk about the social context, what I see as the social and also, of course, political context of what the right to abortion or what access to abortion means, because I am not jumping to a conclusion that everyone here has that perspective, because just looking around, I think that a lot of people right here in the room now have always lived up until 2022 in a nation where abortion was not criminalized, although there were guidelines and restrictions around it, but that it was not a dangerous criminal activity as it is now in how many states? At least 18, right? I do want to mention, though, that even though the organizing that I've done around reproductive justice was post-Roe, I was a young adult pre-Roe. So I actually have had the experience of living in a society where access to abortion was totally problematized and often nil. We were talking at lunch about people who are applying to college and colleges, that we're familiar with. I went to a women's college, which is now a gender-inclusive college. That's Mount Holyoke. And one of the things that was true, I was there from 1965 to 69, so that's pre-Roe. And one of the things that was said when I was in college, dorm rooms were not locked in those days. That's another era. I know it doesn't even make any sense, but yeah, we were in the woods and of Massachusetts, and dorm rooms were not locked. But when and stealing thefts was not a big issue at all. But when there were waves of thefts in a dorm, the common understanding was, oh, somebody must need an abortion. So that's, as I said, I lived through that. And I was particularly then, of course, devastated when Dobbs was decided, because I knew about the before, I lived through the after, and now this is the after. The work that I did on reproductive justice was most signally, of course, I believe that access to abortion as health care was a right for people who can become pregnant. But I had concentrated, and this was in the mid-1970s in Boston, I concentrated a lot of my activity around reproductive justice on sterilization abuse. We had a Boston Committee to End Sterilization Abuse. It was affiliated with the New York organization, which is called CARASA, and I can't remember all the words of that acronym, but CARASA was another both sterilization, anti-sterilization, and pro-abortion organization. But as I said, we were focusing on sterilization abuse, and we absolutely saw that work in connection with women of color. Our Committee to End Sterilization Abuse was a multiracial organization, but we had both in that organization and in another organization I'll mention in a few minutes, we had what we called Third World Women's Committees within the those larger organizations, and we would have like community meetings in the South End before gentrification, in Boston. But that was a largely working class, very multiracial community in most of its parts in that period in Boston in the 1970s. We would have women's health nights. We would talk about all kinds of issues, and we were putting reproductive access into the context of women's health generally. That perspective began to be known later as reproductive justice. And I'm thinking of the organization Sister Song, that was one of the most visible co-founders of that organization is Loretta Roth, a long-time friend. But it was Sister Song that looked at access to reproductive health for women of color in a holistic way. We were doing that around that same time, but before that organization was founded. Another thing that I worked on in the 1970s was opposition to the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment came out in 1976. There was a member of Congress named Henry Hyde, and he brought forth legislation to prevent the use of Medicaid funding for abortion. And we were, of course, quite opposed to that. The name of the organization in Boston was the Abortion Action Coalition. One of the things that we talked about, and both the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse and the Abortion Action Coalition, the core leadership of those groups were socialist feminists. So socialist feminists of color, socialist feminists who are not parts of our global South world majority community, but because we had a class, race, and gender analysis, we saw these issues as being very important, and we realized that the Hyde Amendment was going to disproportionately eliminate reproductive access for women who are poor, working poor, and women of color who are disproportionately in that sector of our society and economy. So what I want to, and we're not going to get to a full answer. I certainly can't get to a full answer. But I think what we have to think about these days is, why are these people so obsessed by controlling people's bodies? And we can get into that. Well, of course, the easy answers, or the two-word answers, are misogyny and patriarchy. Being able to control women's reproduction controls a lot about the rest of, and people who can become pregnant, because not all people who can become pregnant identify as women or even are women. But it determines a lot of what one can do in one's life, even if what one wants to do is to make sure that the children that you have access to the things that you would like them to have, because you're not scraping and struggling on a small, inadequate salary with more kids than you can necessarily support. My understanding, and I'm sure you can confirm this, is that a large proportion of people who seek and have abortions already have children. So it's not about being anti-children or anti-babies. The history of abortion access and how that access became limited when women's health care was medicalized is important to understand. From time out of mind, most births occurred at home. Women received care from other women. And we're going back millennia. I'm talking about going back millennia. But in the 19th century, in the United States and in other countries, medicine began to become professionalized, and women were pushed out of reproductive care and making decisions about their health, and men took over. There was a point, and we try to get back to that too, second wave feminists and others have tried to get back to an understanding that things that happen with women's bodies are not illnesses, that they are functions, of their biological, profile. And therefore, instead of seeing pregnancy and childbirth as a crisis/illness that has to take place, in a hospital setting, some people do indeed choose and have very successful home births. But that's like after a period, as I said, of it being medicalized, and also not only medicalized, but treated with drugs. It was a drugged experience, like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, that medical way of dealing with what we would have to say is a fairly common occurrence, which is giving birth. That was experience that people had. It was in men's, often in men's hands, who have, to our knowledge, and I'm talking about cisgender heterosexual men, haven't had babies as of yet. So that's what was going on. There's a wonderful book called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers. It came out in 1973, published by the Feminist Press, one of my publishers, actually. And it's by Deirdre English and Barbara Ehrenreich. And now I'm going to read some notes from a notebook as opposed to from my phone. From the point that humans grasp where babies came from, because people didn't always know, or humanoids, whoever they were, they didn't always know. It's kind of magical, But when they began to grasp, the causality, those who could have babies have made efforts to control their reproduction. 1 out of 4 women have had abortions. Among women who sought and found remedies to prevent or terminate pregnancies were Black enslaved women who were subject to sexual exploitation and wholesale rape. So what Clarence Thomas, what can I say? I'm in a formal setting, so I can't say all the things I would say. But when Clarence Thomas racializes, as Melissa's and Kate's article points out, when he tries to racialize access to abortion as a plot to diminish the Black population, we've heard that before. We heard that a lot in the 1970s when Black nationalism and male-dominated theories of liberation were very much in force. But that's not really exactly how that is. And as I said, during enslavement, the hundreds of years of enslavement, African women who were enslaved were indeed doing what they could not to produce more capital for those who owned them. Another thing that we have to look at or need to look at when we think about why they are so focused on ending that access to medical care is the repression of sexuality in general. There was a conversation this morning about marriage and the research and writing that Professor Murray has done about marriage. Marriage is punishment. And the punishment was if you violated a woman, you could make good on that. You could erase the violation. We're talking about rape. you could erase that by marrying her. And that is still in force in some societies and cultures. But as I said, that repression of sexuality really has many tentacles, and we are seeing that now. Attacks on bodily autonomy and decision-making, which include people who are trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and are queer. So there's a, as an out Black lesbian, I was saying just yesterday that I've been out for about 50 years, which just seems insane, but I did come out in the mid-1970s. Very different landscape, very different risk, very different, just a different world. There are intersections between what is happening around reproductive freedom and what is happening to the absolute erasure of the existence of people who are trans, because that's what the current administration has seen fit to do. And then the last thing I want to raise, this is a question, although I do have a perspective about it. What has the concept of democracy meant in the United States previously? Oops, that's a problem of using my phone. Here it is. What has the concept of democracy meant in the United States previously, and what does it mean now? As somebody who's always been a part of the left politically, some of us are not as invested in the democratic project that the United States has supposedly been previously as some others have. I have a friend who said, when we were talking once about this concept of democracy, he said, it's not ours and it's not a democracy. And of course, what she meant by that is that when you have sectors, large sectors of the population who are basically excluded from democratic participation, as during the genocide of indigenous people, and also chattel enslavement, and still into the present, the way that people are disenfranchised and cannot participate, then you have to raise the question, what kind of a democracy is it? So I'm going to end with that, and I sort of look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. I'm just like in awe of being on this panel with both of you, with my dear friend and scholar, Melissa. Congratulations on this distinguished honor of being a Hess Fellow, and all of your work in talking about Dobbs and democracy in this moment, and with Barbara Smith, who is just a longtime shero of mine, and the formative work that you and so many other leaders like Loretta Ross and the kind of the mothers, aunties, sisters of the reproductive justice movement that created a home for many of us who were coming up in a freedom and rights-based fight to see and center ourselves in that space and understand that there's actually a difference between a fight for justice and a fight for freedom, right? There's a difference between fighting to be seen and be included and understood and centered in the work versus just fighting for the actual right to do that. And so, again, it's like such a privilege. I think I want to pick up from where you just left the conversation, Barbara, because I was struck listening to Melissa and your and Kate's paper on the distorted democracy, and thinking about how distorted does democracy have to be until we call it an autocracy, until we call it tyranny. And I think about that from the vantage point of, Planned Parenthood. For those of you who know Planned Parenthood, we are a Planned Parenthood affiliates serve 2 million patients across this country. Planned Parenthood Federation of America operates 49, our affiliates, there are 49 affiliates across the country. And I watch them every day open up doors to their clinics where people come in to get basic sexual and reproductive health care, STI testing, wellness exams, family planning, or access to contraception, abortion where they're able to, gender-affirming care. And oftentimes, they're walking through protesters, they're fearing violence, they are worried that if they show up on any given day, that immigration authorities may show up and they will be taken away. They are worried about leaving the clinics and being stopped and criminalized for any other offense, or traveling from state to state, one of the banned 18 or 19 banned states, into a state where they can get access, and merely crossing the state line and worrying about what the implication of that will be for them after they, of course, have left their taken off from work. They have gotten access to child care because you are correct, the majority of people who seek access and get access to abortion are already parents. They have had to secure likely elder care because they are taking care of extended family members, and identifying ways to both get up the resources to travel, get hotel room, get gas, pay for services, and then also return home with missed wages. So the impact of what is happening kind of in what I would say is a fundamentally tyrannical moment that has created a public health care crisis really, for me, calls into question how distorted does a democracy have to be, and we can still call it a democracy. We are living in a world now where the majority of Americans believe that we should have access to basic private medical decisions like abortion. In every state across the union, there is majority support for access to abortion, as well as the decriminalization and protecting of patients and providers. And yet we have seen, since before the Dobbs decision, an increasing uneasy patchwork of political projects that has put us like square in the middle of the bullseye that both Melissa and Barbara have painted so well. So as I ask the question about the distortion of democracy, I also want to make the case that I believe abortion can also save democracy. I want to try to end us on a little bit of a hope piece, right? I don't think we can do that until we understand the fundamental kind of political structural advantage that the opposition to reproductive freedom has built. And the fact that this current iteration of that structure has an overlay of a center-right political ideology that is also gaining steam with some of these just for lack of a better way of phrasing it, anti-woke, anti-DEI agendas, ways that are trying to normalize our ability to see race, to see gender, to see difference as part of a political project of consolidating power. I joined the board of Planned Parenthood in 2011 before I stepped into this role in 2020. And I got to see over that decade the way in which the operationalizing of a distorted democracy has led to the moment that we are in now. So imagine what is that now? 15 years ago in 2010, is that 15 years? Yeah, 2010. You have a then President Barack Obama facing a midterm election and a backlash related to, among other things, probably what we would be terming now around anti-DEI agenda, but maybe not speaking it in those same terms, much different terms. But those midterms, that backlash in the midterms, where political parties oftentimes typically lose Congress, 12 years ago, that the loss of Congress also swept state houses, also transformed Congress, but did so during a census year, right? A significant census year, which allowed those state houses to then create the gerrymandering that Melissa laid the groundwork to install, a tyrant and weaponize rules changes to push through judges to take over the courts. So we're looking at a patchwork, right? I think the question that I keep asking myself is how can it be, right? Like when we talk about how, essentially abortion explains how democracy has failed us, and people want to understand how Roe was lost, I take them back to the 2010, not back to 1973. The political project to fight against Roe had also been, there had been a lot of groundwork laid there, but the real kind of where those theories became operationalized into practice in 2010 really started to shift the structural landscape, so that you get a situation where the majority of people in every state support the right to safe and legal abortion, and yet almost half the country lacks access to care. And the politicians who are enacting those policies don't have to be held accountable as they would in other political projects. And because even though the Constitution has created systems of checks and balances to protect us against the tyranny of the majority through the relentless power building, right? So to talk about democracy in relationship to power building and a descent into autocracy, that's how I believe we are sitting in this space. When you have people who are willing to where power is the end game, and so whether we're calling that misogyny, white supremacy, patriarchy, or corporatocracy, whatever the agenda is, because I do believe it's a set of strange bedfellows that have come together to hold power in this moment. What we are seeing on the ground are folks who are more willing to destroy democracy than let us participate in it. Right? People who are willing to actually drain the water from the swimming pool rather than let everybody swim in it. And I think that is something that we have to hold. And when you look globally, we see this as well. We see that when there are more countries descending into autocracies than there are into democracies. The first thing that an autocratic or potentially autocratic tyrannical government does, authoritarian government does, is they attack reproductive freedom, because they can control half of the population almost immediately. And so when you think about the patterns of what we have seen, the challenges of that. So right now, 39% of women of reproductive age and more gender expansive folks no longer have access to abortion in state. That's more than half of all Black women and gender expansive folks who live in those states. We have seen increased burden, increased criminalization. We've also seen how abortion bans have made pregnancy more dangerous. We're having different, more expansive conversations about sexual and reproductive health care and not separating abortion out, as the reproductive justice colleagues have always asked of the freedom movement. They've killed at least 5 women who were blocked from getting life-saving care in Georgia and Texas, and those are just the ones that we know of. And we are watching patients and providers and judges struggle to understand the restrictions and of the imprisonment. So I think that when we talk about the kind of opportunities we have right now in this moment, and I do think that we are in a very critical moment over the next 2 years. The next 2 elections are either going to save our democracy or further cement the authoritarian rule under which most of you and your families and children will live in. And so I say that not to be hyperbolic. I say that not to scare you. I say that to put a fire under all of us, that if democracy is critical to our being and the protection of our institutions, this is the time to act now. I say that as someone who's leading an organization that is under attack from all sides, and we've always been under attack. Make no mistake, we provide very stigmatized healthcare. But when you have a trifecta of of people who oppose reproductive freedom in the courts, in Congress, and in the White House, you see the collection of attacks coming at you. Tomorrow, I'm going to be at the Supreme Court for a case where the state of South Carolina is trying to take away our Medicaid funding. Congress is going to have is having a similar conversation around denying access to Medicaid across the country. In several other spheres, in other courthouses, we are fighting. And today, the administration and the White House announced a defunding of Planned Parenthood in the Title X program, which is the nation's largest fund to support access to contraception for low-income communities. And why? Why? Because we are providing this care, not because we are providing access to abortion, because they actually didn't do it under fighting with us about the Hyde Amendment. They did it because Planned Parenthood supports DEI, because we have a chief equity officer, because we actually believe that we should do the work and build the skill sets and the competencies to actually see the people when they come in to be seen. That is why we are being denied federal funds to do the work that we do. So saving democracy looks a lot like what Melissa laid out, right? It is the fighting state by state to protect in state constitutions. And I believe that the way we need to think about that is to think about the broad, the fact that abortion is the big tent of both parties. It is a bipartisan issue. You don't win in Kansas and Montana and Kentucky and Vermont and California and New York without bridging race and class, political party ideology in order to do that. So thinking about how we do that in a way where we are fighting long term for a durable, national, expansive right. A durable meaning it cannot be changed or changed at the whims of any elected official. A national right, so we have access in one, not just one state or two or 15, but everywhere, and expansive. Roe was the floor because even though we had the protections, federal protections, we know that having those protections did not guarantee access. But that is the work that we're going to have to do to build. And with that, I thank you and turn it back to you.
Wow. So thank you to each of you and to all of you collectively. Let's give them another round of applause. I am not going to pretend that I can tie the threads neatly to all of this. That would defy reality. I can offer a few thoughts and ideally direct us, I hope to direct us into a conversation. I can't help thinking that when you talked about the use of DEI, Alexis, as a means of attack against Planned Parenthood, that loops us back in some ways to where Melissa began in talking about the history of democracy in context of homogeneity. And the ways in which what we are up against at the moment is an attempt to reimpose a fantasy of homogeneity that is based on repression and erasure, which is the history of this country, right? Is repression and erasure of all of those who do not fit a particular European-centric, male-centric, but particularly European-centric model. Right? And yet, we have reasons to believe, including in the expansiveness of all of those different states that will vote in by ballot initiative to support abortion. We have grounds to believe that democracy does not, in fact, require homogeneity to function. That we can have a diverse, pluralistic democracy. And that the idea that we must all be the same in some way, or that it must be clear who holds the power and only one group can hold the power, is not in fact reality. So there were many words about distorted democracy, destruction of democracy, the historical meanings of democracy, the history of repression. I would invite all of us, and would be curious to hear your thoughts about thinking about direct democracy in ways that go beyond ballot initiatives, right? Ballot initiatives are an electoral expression of direct democracy, but direct democracy exists in so many other forms, in community organizing, in social movements of various kinds. And I have to say that one place where we see a great deal of direct democracy in relation to abortion is that abortion rates have not gone down. And with full props to Planned Parenthood and all of the clinics that have forcibly held their doors open in the face of brutal assault, an awful lot of those successful abortions may not have begun in a clinic, right? So we are also seeing direct democracy at the level of pragmatic action and pragmatic community support. And Barbara, you talked about some of the origins of that, or prior examples of it. Origins is a little too much to claim for anything that we can speak to. But so I would be curious to hear your thoughts about the different ways in which direct democracy can help us find a pathway to resistance and therefore a pathway out, given the gerrymandered, distorted issues surrounding our electoral democracy?
That's a big question. I really do appreciate the intervention to clarify what is meant by direct democracy. When I was speaking of it, I'm speaking only in terms that political scientists use to refer to ballot initiatives and voter referenda. But obviously, the idea of popular engagement with the democratic process transcends merely voting on a ballot initiative or a referenda. And, there are a lot of legal scholars who for years have argued that our understanding of the Constitution and what it means is not necessarily simply handed down by courts, but is actually made in these fights when popular engagement with issues evolving in constitutional law, that, like women are nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. And yet, through agitation and protest, we have read, or people have pushed, and judges have in turn read women into the terms of the 14th Amendment, and agitators and activists have also tried to actually write women into the Constitution through an ERA, which stands at 38 states ratified, but unclear whether it is now included in the Constitution as a full amendment. So I think that's a really helpful clarification. One thing that we've been talking about, or at least I have been talking about, is just the failure of institutions to withstand the stressors that have been placed upon them, certainly in the last 60 days, but even before then. And I think we just have to come to the recognition that our institutions are not going to save us in this moment. The courts are not going to save us. The courts are holding the line right now against truly authoritarian encroachment, but the courts are not built for this. They are slow-moving by nature. They are sclerotic. They have the opportunity to be reviewed and then heard again and get all the way to the Supreme Court. It's not a winning formula to fight through the courts. Ideally, we would have our legislators fighting for us. And, that's not necessarily the most efficient move either by design. By design, Congress is supposed to be slow-moving, deliberative because of its multi-member status. But right now we have a Congress that has exited the field, maybe with the exception of Cory Booker, who apparently is still talking. Good for him. Okay, I hope he is. Good for him. So that means, who do we have? Maybe it's work in the states and the state legislatures, but mostly it's work in the streets. And if we're really being honest, the moment for saving democracy is really going to be down to people. And the choices that we make in moments that are both profound and banal. We are making choices about democracy when we decide to stand up for academic freedom in a university, when we decide to defend the colleague with whom we don't agree, but who has a right to say what they have said. When we decide as a law firm what cases we're going to take, or whether we are going to let our worries about the repercussions dictate the choices that we make about who we represent, or if we are going to just stand up for the Constitution and the fact that people have a right to be represented, no matter how foul or repugnant their views are. And those can't be itinerant commitments. I see this with my students all the time. Over the course of the Me Too movement, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not we should be giving those who are accused of sexual assault, of sexual harassment, the benefit of due process. And I think this is the moment in which we have to understand that the answer in that moment was obviously yes. Regardless of how repugnant the actions, how repulsive we find the people, were they entitled to due process? Sure. Because right now we want the same due process for people who are being deported against their will to countries where they have never lived. So in these moments, both profound and banal when it really requires us maybe to bend a little, to compromise on what we think. We can't compromise on the principle. Like, I may hate sexual assault, but I still believe in due process. And it can't be a selective or itinerant commitment. It has to be the same in every circumstance. And that's what we're standing up for right now, because there are people who want us to be selective and itinerant about these commitments, and that's how they break us.
I'll speak to the behavior piece of that, because I think it's really important on this question of how we move. And I'm sitting with not the decline, right? Because obviously Planned Parenthood has been able to support, our independent clinics have been able to support people traveling in and out of states to get access to abortion. But it has been the increase of people who have been willing to take bold action, right? Whether they're standing in New York City, protected, working with electeds who have a shield law that allow them to mail pills into states with bans that allow people to get the self-managed care that people have always engaged in when they have needed to get access to abortion. They didn't want to go to a licensed medical provider in community, or could. And I think about oftentimes our movement, or our kind of the way we've been trained to engage in electoral politics and to engage in like a formal democratic process has been one where you focus on building support, you elect people, and then you hold those people accountable to change the policy that you want to see. And there is another world where you can also see the cultural shift, the behavioral shift of how people are getting access to care that renders that policy irrelevant. And so in some ways, kind of like having both and becomes a much stronger play, because you're focusing on how to shift the actual people who are representing you and changing the policy. And you are also kind of engaging in the work that says, I'm still going to continue to get the care, the access, the whatever it is that I need, and I'm going to build that system in order to both for your personal survival, but also to force a different question, and to force, what Dobbs did is it forced a lot of the decisions down. So it allows us to have a different conversation on the state level. And it also brings me back to a quote by Dr. King. I believe I'm gonna bastardize this, but it's something related to a social movement that only moves people is a revolt, but a social movement that moves people and institutions is a revolution. And the need to actually think about like the people part, the behavior part, and the institutional part together when we're thinking about that. That I think it's not selective, it's not itinerant. It's actually a way to build more durable power.
Yeah, I would like to hear either from other people or, I think this has been well addressed already.
All right, so questions from the audience. Please, Gaston will bring you a microphone, and we would love to open the space for your thoughts and your questions.
So, in regards to the whole abortion and voting, do you think that, this is a question, by the way, for Murray, do you think that people should have a direct vote nationwide, or it should be a representative vote?
So it's a really good question. Should we have the abortion issue settled via direct democracy or representative democracy? The first thing to sort of sit with is many states don't have mechanisms for direct democracy, or if they do, they're actually very limited. So right now, the structures for direct democracy are most robust in the Western states that have really had a long tradition of it. I will also say, the history and trajectory of direct democracy is a really mixed one. So the origins of direct democracy are in the progressive era, where it arose as a force to counteract what many viewed as corporate capture of courts and legislatures. So, not unlike some of the complaints you hear today. But that's why direct democracy arose, to allow the people to have these voices, because the courts and the legislatures had been captured by corporate interests, like the railroads and the robber barons and whatnot. But then direct democracy has another kind of epoch of activity, and it's mostly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when in these states, that often Western states, where there's this long tradition of direct democracy, the people start using direct democracy as a means to counteract civil rights gains, whether through the legislature or through the courts. So in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, which obviously dismantled integration in public schools, people in California and Colorado passed ballot initiatives that prohibited busing that was going to be used for integration. When the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act, and then many states followed suit with their own state-level Fair Housing Acts, California voters and Arizona voters passed laws that essentially were framed as about the rights of landlords and property owners to be able to discriminate in the renting of their property or the selling of their property. And so it's kind of a mixed bag when you think about direct democracy. It can certainly be used for good, but it has also been used to allow the majority to suppress the rights of minorities. And I think you really have to worry about that. One of the things I worry about with regard to the use of direct democracy right now, with regard to abortion, is in his Dobbs opinion, Justice Alito notes that women are not without electoral and political power. And that echoes something that Justice Scalia said in an opinion, in a dissenting opinion to the court's decision in 1996, United States versus Virginia. United States versus Virginia was the case in which the court invalidated Virginia Military Institute's single-sex admissions policy. Justice Ginsburg wrote that majority opinion for the court, and it engendered this very fierce dissent from Justice Scalia, who asked, why should the court step in and review VMI's admissions policy so strictly? Usually, strict scrutiny is for situations where minority rights are involved, heightened scrutiny is for minority rights, and women, he noted, aren't really a minority. They're actually a bare majority of the population, and they wield significant electoral power. It's true, women are a bare majority of the American population. The idea that they have significant political power, I think, a little harder to say, given how woefully underrepresented women are in state houses, in Congress, in lobbying, in almost every aspect of political life. But leaving that to the side for the moment, one of the things I worry about with Justice Alito focusing on this idea of women's electoral and political power is that the success of these ballot measures with regard to abortion could fuel the idea that, in fact, women do wield significant political power. They've been able to secure abortion rights in these contexts, and therefore, when we think about the structure of equal protection, we don't have to think about women as minorities in the way we have to think about race as a minority category or illegitimacy as a minority category. Women are outside of it because they have this political power and they're able to wield it at the ballot box. So I think there are real caveats or cautionary signs to heed with regard to direct democracy. But at the same time, I fully recognize how difficult it is to press for reproductive freedom through the representative government process. So I think we use what's available to us right now, but we be clear-eyed about what the risks are. And I think one of the risks of pursuing reproductive freedom through direct democracy is that we are going to be undermining the equal protection structure in which women have been denominated a protected class.
Hi, this is a question for actually all three of you on the panel. But Professor Murray, in your article, you discussed how the Supreme Court is laying groundwork for potential large repeals of other fundamental rights, and that will undoubtedly affect women and specifically women of color. What do we foresee as kind of the next thing that they will come for with regards to women's reproductive rights, and what can we do to prevent or mitigate those effects? And what have we learned historically when we've fought this in the past?
So I don't think I make the argument that other rights are at stake. I think other people have pointed to words that the court and its members have said, in particular, Justice Thomas's concurrence in Dobbs, where, Justice Alito is like, this is only about abortion. Justice Thomas is like, actually, it's not. It's about all these other things. So I think if you take Justice Thomas seriously, and I do, because I think Justice Thomas is actually the most interesting member of the court in that he says really off-the-wall things, and nobody joins him. He doesn't get a lot of people to sign on to his separate opinions usually. So he writes off-the-wall things, nobody signs on, but then they get farmed out to his acolytes in the lower federal courts and in the law schools, and they get stewarded and shepherded into being, and then they come back up to the court. And, this argument that abortion is a tool of eugenic racism is a kind of off-the-wall argument that he sort of put out there in 2019, and no one signed on for it. And then it kind of percolated in the lower federal courts, and then it made it back up to the court in Dobbs in footnote 41 of Dobbs, where Justice Alito is like, hey, did you know that a lot of black fetuses get aborted? Might be a tool of eugenic racism. And he sort of makes that assumption and credits Justice Thomas for it. So I think there are a lot of different ideas going on about what could be next. Certainly, the expansion of the curtailment of reproductive freedom by the use of fetal personhood, I think that is for sure on the table, and we are swiftly moving toward that. I also think there's likely to be real movement around contraception, and that's pretty easy to do because all you have to do is relabel certain forms of contraception as abortifacients, and then they're not contraception, they're not birth control, they're abortions, and you can limit them that way. So long-acting contraception like Norplant, anything that can be subcutaneously implanted, IUDs, for example, like those are all things I think are on the table to be relabeled as abortifacients and curtailed. I think people worry about whether there will be limits on same-sex marriage. I think I'm less worried about that just because I think the idea of withdrawing another right and changing the legal status of so many couples is really problematic in a lot of ways, in part because marriage is so embedded in the way we regulate people and make decisions on an administrative level. But I will also say, I don't think you have to rescind same-sex marriage to make life really terrible for LGBTQ plus people. Yeah, I mean, like you can leave marriage alone and still stick it to everyone who counts themselves as a member of that community. And so there's more to come. I mean, and we're seeing it now, the assault on DEI, the assault on trans people, like contraception is certainly coming. When people are being advised about college and my teenagers' high school, like one of the things they're being told to think about is if you are trans, think about where you can get gender-affirming care. If you are a woman, think about where you will have access to contraception. And so those are, I think, very real fears.
Time for one more question or comment. I'm coming, Bobby. I'm coming. Here you go.
Hi, my name's Bobby. I'm from the right-wing community known as Bell Harbor. And my community's a bit half and half on abortion, but I'm concerned. Well, you see, it seems that my parents don't mind that Roe v. Wade was overturned, but I really am concerned. They're clueless. They watch Fox News, so I'm just very scared, and oh my God. So, what are your, is there anything I can do? Is there any advice I can do to cope with that?
Bobby.
Yes, you're looking at me. I think, I'm not sure exactly who you wish to help or who you wish to perhaps persuade or change. I think it's always so important to find other people who share your perspectives, and by connecting with them, figure out what is it that we want to do in order to help people understand, better. You may not be able to persuade your parents, but there may be people who you see around, do you have a cafeteria here anymore?
Not at the current moment.
Well, around some kind of table. But the thing is, there may be people who can, you can engage with. And I know that this is not a time for people to be, this is not the donor class sitting here. But one of the things that I did when Dobbs, I was in a position to send a little to abortion funds in states where things were at risk. Like, I contribute to Planned Parenthood, I'm proud to say, monthly. So I can say that, sitting right next to the person who runs the whole thing. But the thing is, I also have found other funds, too. It's always hard. Let's be honest. Abortion is a very complicated issue that connects to ethics and morality, values. That's not really what we're talking about exactly here. I think what we're talking about is, given that people seek it out, do we want it to be safe? Do we want it to be accessible? And for those who will never get one or wish to get one, can they be all right that they're living in a country and a society where there are some people who will seek it out and don't need to die in the process? That's really, to me, what the questions are.
We do have a hard stop at 3:30, but I really want to thank each of you for your smarts and your wits and for coming and sharing with us and teaching us. And thank you all of you for joining us tomorrow right here at 11, 12, 15, and 3:40. 3 different panels with Melissa Murray. Thank you so much.
Yes, done.
I knew how long before she wrote it. But I'm thinking about Jane a lot, But see, that was difficult.
Up and speak with the speakers. You're welcome to.